July 25th, 1944, northern France. The sky darkened at mid-morning. Not clouds, not weather, something else entirely. 1,500 American heavy bombers flew in formations so dense they blotted out the sun over a strip of Norman countryside 3.5 miles long, 1.5 miles deep. The men of the Panzer-Lehr Division looked up from their foxholes and hedgerow positions. Some had fought in Russia, some had survived North Africa. They were among the finest armored soldiers Germany had ever produced. Veterans, every one. The backbone of the Western Front's defense. None of that mattered now. The first bombs hit at the northern edge of the rectangle, then the next wave, then the next. High explosives and fragmentation bombs fell in a carpet pattern so methodical it resembled industrial production more than warfare. The earth jumped. It kept jumping. Positions that had been carefully dug and reinforced over weeks ceased to exist in seconds. The bombing killed over 1,000 Panzer-Lehr soldiers in a matter of hours. Many more lay wounded in collapsed trenches, screaming into dirt that wouldn't stop shaking. Of the 45 armored vehicles operational that morning, 7 could still move when the silence finally came. 7. When the dazed survivors crawled from their shattered positions to face the American ground assault rolling toward them, they found something worse than defeat. They no longer commanded an effective fighting force capable of coordinated resistance. The elite division, the one built from instructor cadres, the one stocked with veterans who had fought on every front, had been erased. But this story does not begin here. It begins with a lie. A comfortable, familiar lie that German commanders told themselves about the Americans. A lie born in the North African desert 2 years earlier. February 1943, Tunisia. The Americans who landed in North Africa were green. Everybody knew it. The Germans knew it best. At Kasserine Pass, Rommel's Africa Corps hit the untested American Second Corps like a hammer striking glass. The line broke. Units scattered. Officers lost contact with their men. Men lost contact with reality. In 6 days, the Americans suffered 6,500 casualties. 3,000 were captured. The defeat was ugly. Not the kind of ugly that gets dressed up in after-action reports. The kind where soldiers abandoned equipment and ran. Where communication collapsed. Where panic spread through battalions like fever. German intelligence officers took careful notes. They measured the Americans and found them wanting. Poorly led. Tactically naive. Brave enough individually, perhaps, but brittle under pressure. One hard shove and the whole structure came apart. This assessment traveled up the chain of command. It settled into the institutional memory of the Wehrmacht like sediment at the bottom of a river. It became an assumption. Then it became doctrine. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding German forces in the West, built his defensive strategy on this foundation. The Americans would struggle. The Americans would stall. The Americans, when hit hard enough and fast enough, would crumble, as they had at Kasserine. Perhaps the lesson of Kasserine would repeat itself in France. Rundstedt positioned his forces accordingly. He would screen off the British sector around Caen, where Montgomery's veterans posed the greater threat, while concentrating his mobile reserves against the Americans. The terrain in the American sector, the ancient Norman bocage, so strongly favored the defense that even mediocre troops could hold it. Against the Americans? With elite formations like Panzer-Lehr holding the line, it seemed almost unfair. The German commanders who made this calculation were not stupid men. They were experienced, professional, and thorough. They were also measuring the Americans of 1944 with the yardstick of 1943. That was the first mistake. The bocage was a nightmare made of vegetation. Ancient hedgerows, earthen banks up to 15 feet high, topped with centuries of dense growth, divided the Norman countryside into thousands of tiny enclosed fields. Each field was a fortress. Each hedgerow was a wall. The roads between them were sunken lanes where ambush was not a possibility but a certainty. American infantry bled for every yard. A company would fight all morning to take one field, then look across the next hedgerow and see another identical field waiting, and another behind that, and another. Tanks could not push through the hedgerows without climbing over them. When a Sherman climbed, its belly tilted skyward, exposing the thin underside armor to German anti-tank fire. The first tank to try it usually burned. The crew of the second tank watched and learned nothing useful, because there was nothing to learn. The physics of the problem didn't change. The offensive ground to a halt. A bloody stalemate. Thousands of American lives spent for gains measured in yards rather than miles. German commanders observed this from their positions and allowed themselves a careful, professional satisfaction. The bocage was doing exactly what they expected. The pattern was holding. Rundstedt's calculation appeared sound. In the hedgerow-lined fields, Panzer-Lehr's veterans dug deeper. They registered their mortars. They sighted their anti-tank guns along the narrow lanes. They waited for the next American attack with the patience of men who had done this before on other fronts against other enemies. What they could not see, what no German intelligence officer reported, because no German intelligence officer knew, was what was happening behind American lines. In workshops and motor pools and muddy fields miles from the front, American soldiers were building something, and they were building it from German steel. The American military in 1944 had a quality that German doctrine had no framework to predict. Units began independently developing solutions to the hedgerow problem, not waiting for orders, not requesting guidance from higher headquarters. Sergeants and corporals and tank crews looked at the problem in front of them and started welding. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 2nd Armored Division created the most famous innovation of the Normandy campaign. Steel prongs bolted to the front of a Sherman tank that allowed it to burst through hedgerows at ground level. No climbing, no exposed belly armor. Straight through the wall of earth and root and centuries-old growth like a bull through a fence. The material he used came from Rommel's beach obstacles, the steel barriers that the field marshal had ordered planted along the invasion coast to stop Allied landing craft, cut apart, hauled inland, and welded onto American tanks to destroy the very defensive line those obstacles were meant to protect. General Omar Bradley saw a demonstration of the device. He ordered mass production immediately. Within 3 weeks, 3 out of 5 tanks in 1st Army mounted hedgerow cutters. The device was kept strictly secret from German intelligence to maximize surprise when the breakout offensive finally came. Panzer-Lehr held its positions. Its commanders studied the American sector through binoculars and saw the same struggling enemy they expected to see. The bocage was still the bocage. The hedgerows still stood. The stalemate continued. Except it didn't. Behind the lines, hundreds of Shermans now carried steel teeth forged from Rommel's own defenses. Bomber groups received their target coordinates. Bradley's staff drew a rectangle on the map, 3.5 miles by 1.5 miles, directly over Panzer-Lehr's positions. The strategy might have worked against a different enemy, one with less capacity for rapid institutional learning. It did not work against the Americans of 1944. The German commanders, who observed the American struggles in June and early July, briefly allowed themselves to hope that the pattern might hold. It was a reasonable hope. The evidence supported it. Every day, the bocage consumed more American infantry and produced no breakthrough. Every day, the front lines barely moved. The math favored the defense, and the math had been reliable for weeks. But hope, built on pattern recognition, has a fatal weakness. It cannot account for what it has never seen. Rundstedt's strategy rested on an assumption that American soldiers would crumble under determined surprise assault, as they had at Kasserine nearly 2 years before. He had screened off the British. He had concentrated his best mobile reserves, including Panzer-Lehr, against the American sector. The terrain favored him. History favored him. The assumption was wrong. Not wrong in the way a miscalculation is wrong, where you adjust the numbers and try again. Wrong in the way a foundation is wrong, where everything built on top of it collapses at once. The Americans of 1944 were not the Americans of Kasserine. The institution had learned, not slowly, not grudgingly, but with a speed and thoroughness that the Wehrmacht's hierarchical structure could not match and did not anticipate. Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer-Lehr from his forward headquarters, had no intelligence suggesting what was coming. No reports of the hedgerow cutters. No warning about the bomber formations assembling on English airfields. No indication that the rectangle of Norman countryside his division occupied had been selected as the killing ground for the largest tactical air bombardment in history. His men maintained their positions. They cleaned their weapons. They wrote letters that would never be mailed. The morning of July 25th arrived clear and warm. Good flying weather. The first bombs hit before the sound reached them. The ground heaved. Foxholes collapsed inward. Men who had survived Stalingrad and Kursk and the desert pressed themselves into Norman dirt and discovered that experience meant nothing against this. There was no tactic for it, no doctrine, no courage sufficient to answer 1,500 bombers dropping their loads in methodical, overlapping waves across a rectangle that contained everything: every bunker, every trench, every vehicle park, every command post that made Panzer-Lehr a fighting division. The bombing went on. It kept going on. Tanks flipped onto their turrets. Ammunition stores detonated in chain reactions that sent shrapnel through positions the bombs had missed. Communications lines ceased to exist. The chain of command dissolved into isolated clusters of men who could not see, could not hear, could not coordinate with anyone beyond the rim of their own crater. 1,000 soldiers from Panzer-Lehr died in those hours. The number of wounded was never precisely counted. Of 45 operational armored vehicles, 38 became wreckage, burning, overturned, or buried under displaced earth. 7 tanks could still move. 7. Then the ground assault came. American infantry and armor, Shermans fitted with hedgerow cutters that Panzer-Lehr had never seen, never been warned about, punched through the bocage like it wasn't there. The defensive terrain that Rundstedt had staked everything on opened up like a door. The dazed survivors emerged from their shattered positions. They reached for weapons. They looked for officers. They tried to form lines. There was nothing to form. No line, no reserve, no communication, no armor. They no longer commanded an effective fighting force capable of coordinated resistance. The elite division, the instructor cadres, the Eastern Front veterans, the finest armored formation in the German military, had been systematically taken apart in a single morning. The breakthrough at Cobra opened the door for exactly the kind of sweeping mobile warfare that German generals had believed only they possessed the skill and audacity to conduct. American armor poured through the gap where Panzer-Lehr had been. Columns fanned out across open French countryside at speeds the German command structure could not track, could not respond to, could not comprehend in real time. The bocage was behind them. The war of movement had begun, and the Germans were on the wrong side of it. Within days, the careful defensive architecture that Rundstedt had constructed began to collapse. Not in one sector, everywhere. Units that had held their positions for weeks found themselves outflanked, cut off, their supply lines severed by American spearheads that had already passed them by. The retreat became a rout. The rout became a trap. By August, approximately 60,000 German soldiers were caught in the Falaise pocket, squeezed into a shrinking perimeter by American forces from the south and British and Canadian forces from the north. The roads inside the pocket became impassable. Vehicles jammed bumper to bumper. Horses and men and machines pressed together in a space that grew smaller by the hour. 10,000 German soldiers died in the pocket. 50,000 surrendered when escape became impossible and further resistance pointless. A German general named Lutwitz described what he saw. Mountains of vehicles, dead horses, dead soldiers, scattered over the roads. The destruction that began with 1,500 bombers over a rectangle of Norman countryside had metastasized into the annihilation of an entire army group. Panzer-Lehr, what remained of it, was somewhere in that wreckage. No longer a division, barely a memory. Eisenhower walked the battlefield at Falaise 2 days after the pocket finally closed. He wrote afterward that the scenes could be described only by Dante. It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. The men who had planned and executed this destruction took no particular pleasure in describing it. They recorded it. They moved on. There was still a war to finish. But the Germans who survived could not move on so easily. Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for the German High Command, delivered his assessment with the bluntness of a man who had run out of euphemisms. The war was already lost in the West, he said, at the time of the breakthrough and the beginning of the War of Movement in France. Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored warfare, the man who had written the doctrine that Panzer-Lehr was built to execute, offered a different kind of verdict. Speaking of the American commanders, he said, "From the standpoint of a tank specialist, I must congratulate him on his victory, since he acted as I would have done had I been in his place." The irony was precise and total. Germany's greatest tank theorist acknowledged that the Americans had beaten his best students using his own principles. And Fritz Bayerlein, the commander of Panzer-Lehr, the man who had watched his elite division disappear in a single morning, he became a prisoner of war. In captivity, he began to write. He would produce 20 separate manuscripts. Each one described in clinical detail what happened to his division on that catastrophic day. 20 manuscripts, the same story told 20 times. 20 manuscripts. A man does not write the same account 20 times because he has explained it well. He writes it 20 times because he cannot make it make sense. Because the distance between what he believed and what happened is too vast to cross in a single telling, or a tenth. Bayerlein had commanded one of the finest armored formations in the entire German military, cadres of experienced veterans, men who had fought in every theater, equipment drawn from the best Germany could produce. He had held terrain that favored the defense so heavily that his superiors considered it nearly impregnable. He had faced an enemy that his intelligence services assessed as brittle, poorly led, and prone to collapse under pressure. Every assumption was wrong. Not partially wrong, entirely wrong. Wrong in a way that killed 1,000 of his men in hours and turned 45 tanks into 7. The Americans he had been told would crumble had instead reinvented their own tactics from the ground up. A sergeant had welded scrap steel from Rommel's beach obstacles onto a tank and broken the bocage wide open. 1,500 bombers had erased his division from the order of battle in a single morning. No campaign in history, Bayerlein wrote, could approach the Battle of Annihilation in France in 1944. In the magnitude of planning, the logic of execution, the seamless collaboration of sea, air, and ground forces, the bulk of captured equipment, or the hordes of prisoners taken. He wrote it as a prisoner, in a quiet room, with nothing left but a pen and the question that would not stop asking itself. How did we not see it coming? He wrote 20 answers. None of them were enough.